So when we first started, obviously we had SMPTE 2110 and NMOS in the broadcast world, and we were gaining some momentum and success with that. And meanwhile, we were really looking at the Pro AV market, and to us, the business case really seemed, kind of obvious. Open standards had already formed the backbone of the broadcast industry since the 40s, right? And we were really enjoying that kind of interoperable multi-vendor ecosystem. Meanwhile, the Pro AV market had many successful AV over IP solutions, but really no open standard. And so that left a lot of fragmentation that was holding them back. AV over IP was part of modern systems, but it really wasn't the foundation of communication, right? You had these islands of AV over IP, you had HD-base-T, which is like a baseband over Cat5 running, and you had just an awful lot of baseband. But it wasn't taking off. It wasn't becoming lingua franca like it was in the broadcast space. So we believed that we could bring open standards into the Pro AV market and solve that interoperability problem. So we went into the Pro AV market with our great ideas. We showed them what we had, but initially we had quite a few gaps. We were bringing in uncompressed SMPTE 2110. We were showing everything that we were doing in the broadcast world, very interesting and everything else, but the market really didn't bite. Now we knew these things going into it. It wasn't like we were totally blind to it, but the main issues were, of course, we didn't have any HDCP solution. In the AV over IP world, the KVM use case, where you're using your keyboard and mouse and you're seeing the video and you're doing that all over IP, was a huge use case, and you couldn't really have an AV over IP solution without it. In our space, it's uncompressed, right? In the Pro AV space, by far, 1 gig solutions were dominant. You saw things like SDVOE with 10 gigs had some success and still is, somewhat successful today. But by far, it was like, 10 to 1, both in gigabits and also in an uptake. 1 gig was far more dominant. Also, too, we heard over and over again, we don't want your SMPTE 2110 with your PTP in our facilities. PTP-aware switches aren't really that common, and people's awareness of how to run PTP networks was spotty at best, except, you have AES 67, and of course there was quite a bit of Dante, which had some PTP, but overall in the larger infrastructure and the larger IT space, that was a real hurdle. So, due in part because of reality and also in part because of competitive marketing against us, SMPTE 2110 had a bit of a reputation in the Pro AV space as being a bit too complex. Oh, one more thing I want to say too. One of my favorite things was running around Infocom and NAB saying, SMPTE 2110 plus NMOS plus all the things that we're going to do with it. And that was also another problem. We had kind of a messaging problem there. So that in 2020, we launched IPMX. And so IPMX, is the first time we put a brand name around it. We developed a roadmap for Pro AV. We really went forward and kind of put out all of the things that we were going to accomplish. Another thing we did at that show is we had really the first prototype of a 1 gig, 1 gig solution that wasn't using PTP and was otherwise completely compatible with SMPTE 2110. So it was everything SMPTE 2110, but we had the ability to do no PTP back then. That's also around the time that we really started actually developing all of the specs and everything. We'll talk about that today, so I'm not going to go over these, but that's when the VSF took up the TR10 specs to fill in those gaps. That's when we, defined, what the islands of work were going to be, asynchronous operation, optional PTP, USB, all those things. And then also, too, not to leave AMWA out of this, NMOS, there were some other things that we needed to add in there. We needed to support the ability to behave more like Pro AV connections behave, where your laptop adjusts to what the screen needs, and if things change, everything happens dynamically. So all of those things were kind of laid out in that roadmap, and it began for us, really starting to see, this could be real. Now, at that point, the problems we were solving were really, if you think about it, that 1 gig 4K 60 444 desktop content over a 1 gig connection. That was kind of where we started. We really thought of IPMX as really attacking that space. However, you also had things like H.264, very popular in PTZ cameras, that you would use in like a conference room and things like that. And you had, also you had on kind of the other end of the scale, you had people using AV over IP in uncompressed outside of broadcast. So that would be like museums where they really don't want any kind of compression where they're blowing up the image to a really big size, or medical imaging, or just anywhere, that they were really sensitive to quality. Obviously not a huge segment of that market. Again, SDVOE was a 10 gig solution that for the most part was uncompressed, but still a significant amount of people out there wanted it. And plus, we already had uncompressed defined and done in SMPTE 2110. So we went from looking at IPMX as being kind of a specialized version of SMPTE 2110 that was only going to be compressed, to really an AV over IP ecosystem where we would break IPMX up into a framework that included profiles and capabilities to further define IPMX in a way that could be flexible and adapt and evolve without having to have version 2 of IPMX and version 3. And we're going to have talks later today that cover that. So just to kind of zero in a little bit more, this is kind of an eye chart here, but really market demand for IPMX comes kind of from 3 different spaces, right? So you've got, in the one hand, you've got kind of an advanced Pro AV, where you can kind of, actually, here, let me just skip to this next slide here, which kind of shows that. So you've got, really 3 different areas here, right? You've got signal management where you're moving signals around, you're controlling the AV over IP system, and you got professional equipment. We'll call that kind of like your sort of live production a bit, NDI space, right? We're doing live production, we're doing video production, but we're not doing it in the broadcast space. And that includes the AV signal management and things like that. And then you have like what I would call that 1 gig 444, I plug my laptop in, that projector can put it up on the screen. That's like your standard Pro AV, right? So think about like classrooms. I'm not running a production there. I'm just setting the equipment up, and the professor uses it. They hit buttons on a panel, and it works, right? So that's kind of that second bucket. In the first one with professional equipment, you do have people that kind of know the equipment that are using it. In the second one, you have people that integrate the equipment, and then lay people that are just using it kind of in public. And the third bucket is kind of interesting. And in this bucket, really, group 3 kind of encompasses all of this. So this would be like your large enterprise organizations. And actually, even it kind of spills into group 2 here, where you're doing all of the things in the prior 2 groups, but you're also doing a lot of integrations with Teams and Zoom and those kind of things. So in that group, you really have your like IT department buying a lot of the equipment. It's not necessarily an AV integrator that's involved, or it is, but it's more kind of on the IT integration side and less on like the installed cable infrastructure side of things. So you end up with kind of like a mess, or a matrix of different things, different technologies that make up your whole system, and none of it's really managed as one cohesive unit, right? You've got your corporate IT AV assets that maybe are driven by Teams or by some API, and in the middle you've got like maybe a QSC or a Crestron or an AMX system in the middle, or where you've got your touch screens and things are kind of automated and installed by an integrator. And then you have your professional equipment like your NDI systems, your live production systems, all of those kind of coexisting in the same building, but none of them really tightly integrated together. So in the professional equipment area, really you've got SMPTE 2110 and NDI together that kind of cover that space. In the Pro AV signal management, you've got a lot of proprietary solutions, and maybe SMPTE 2110 and NDI are also part of that space. And then in the corporate IT assets, you know, NDI integrates really well with those things, so you see that quite a bit in there. And you're talking about, like, you know, standard NIC cards, you know, USB devices, and stuff you can maybe even buy off of Amazon as part of that kind of third bucket. So with that flexibility I was talking about earlier with profiles and everything else, we aimed really to solve all three problems, right?